Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. It's the first of our inquiry into rail investment pipelines. We're going to be looking at how to move away from boom and bust towards a planned, steady programme of projects and investments in railway stations, track and rolling stock. Today we'll be questioning the publicly owned rail infrastructure manager, Network Rail, and then two principal rail industry associations on the full range of the inquiry's terms of reference. This inquiry today will set the scene for the further evidence sessions which will follow. Could I ask our first panel of witnesses to introduce themselves, please?
Good morning, my name is Andrew Haines and I'm the Chief Executive at Network Rail.
And I'm Jeremy Westlake, I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Network Rail.
Welcome. So, Sir Andrew, looking back on your career in rail, would you say that in the UK we are investing effectively in our railway infrastructure?
Well, if you'll forgive me starting on a pun, we're definitely on a journey. I started almost 40 years ago, it'll be 40 years in September, and at that period of time we'd been through 60 almost consecutive years of decline in passenger numbers. Very, very piecemeal, incremental approach to enhancement investment and year-on-year cuts in maintenance and renewals. And that created a vicious spiral of decline in passenger and freight usage. Then in the 1990s, two very significant things happened. First of all, the railways were privatised, and as part of that, they were broken up. And in order to maintain private interest, the principle of 5-year funding settlements was established, where a privately owned infrastructure operator could have confidence in an independently agreed, regulated 5-year settlement. And that gave, for the first time, a 5-year window in which you could plan maintenance renewals and, at that time, enhancements. Although it's fair to say that at the start of that privatisation journey, there was no real plan for enhancements. The assumption effectively was, I think, to be honest, that numbers would continue to decline or at least stabilise. And then the second big thing that happened was the economy of Britain shifted. We had a significant increase in population and more dependence on a service economy that was city-centre based. And that meant in the subsequent 20 years we had a more than doubling of passenger numbers. So that by the time we got to COVID, asset failures on the infrastructure had halved. We were now one of the safest railways in the world. And customer numbers were very much bigger, and therefore both governments in Cardiff Bay, in Holyrood and in Westminster wanted to grow the network and enhance its capability. Passengers were expecting higher levels of service. And there was commitment to very, very big infrastructure projects. And all of that came with a big price tag. But we were left with a system that meant that it was very hard to squeeze additional capacity out of it. And then when inflation and passenger uncertainty came post-COVID, we ended up then with two further seismic shocks. So where we are now, I think, is we've still got the benefit of the 5-year settlement, but in the last few years we've seen inflation hit that really for the first time since the privatisation model was settled. This is the first time we've seen significant inflation. And we've now seen the cost of inflation hitting some of those big committed infrastructure programmes, HS2, TRU, East-West Rail. And that has meant there's now real pressure on things which are not part of that core package. So definitely better than where we were 40 years ago. Significant improvements in many ways, but I think we're absolutely hitting an inflection point because of that combination of big infrastructure improvements and the impact of inflation on what is an aging asset base.
Okay, so why does the rail industry describe the approach to rail investment in this country as one of boom and bust?
It's not a term I would use,
okay.
But I think what is absolutely true is that the commitment of big programs like HS2 are very, very significant. You know, we're probably spending more money on enhancements in our network than we've done for 100 years in real terms. Typically about £7 billion a year on HS2 at the moment, around about £1 billion a year on Transpine and route upgrade for the next 6 or 7 years. if East West Rail proceeds as it's planned, about £500 million on that. So if you're in those projects, you're part of the boom. Yeah. But if you're not in those projects, then the pipeline of funding available for other projects is much more reduced. And then the second thing I would say is because inflation has eaten into the value of our renewal settlement, so our regulatory settlement, although still a very good discipline, has been eroded by the impact of inflation.
Okay, well, we're going to be drilling down into more of the impacts of what many people call boom and bust, even if you don't. Lawrence, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. One of the issues that we're interested in as a committee is the future arm's length relationship of shadow GBR and what that would look like in practice. So thinking about the experience of Network Rail and looking back over the last 10 years, there does seem to have been occasions where the political timetable has overlapped with the control period timetable in some uncomfortable ways. So the delays to Great Western and Midland Main Line electrification, for example, were only disclosed immediately after the 2015 election. The current government says that there was a significant funding gap on some transport projects. Have you ever been under pressure, or the organisation been under pressure in your time to announce certain projects before time, or to withhold information from disclosure in respect of political pressure?
That's quite an easy one for me. No, I'm not, but that's partly, I guess, because I arrived just as the separation of renewals and enhancement funding had taken place. And so from the 1st of April 2019, enhancement funding was directly controlled and released by the government. So those decisions are in any case matters for government and not for us as Network Rail. It's what is absolutely true that in the 5 years prior to that, what we saw was renewals and, if you like, maintaining the core railway was cut back because of the increasing cost of some of those big schemes like Great Western electrification. Because prior to that 2019 point, it was there was an overall spending cap for both enhancements and renewals. So there were definitely some trade-offs having to be made there, but I've never had that pressure because those decisions are not Network Rail's decisions to take.
Okay, and you're not aware of equivalent pressure in your time on the wider organisation? I know you said not for yourself.
No, absolutely not, because we have a very strong independent regulator on the maintenance renewals activity, and they scrutinise, in considerable detail, our own expenditure, including ensuring that we don't drift into using that funding for enhancement purposes. It's one of the things they're very keen to ensure that we ring fence.
That's a very reassuring answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. Can you briefly outline in railway terms the difference between renewals and enhancements and what role Network Rail has in administering these? I don't know who's the best person to take.
I'll start with that, but then maybe move on.
There's some sub-questions as well, so there'll be plenty to answer.
So, look, the railways are probably almost unique in terms of the breadth of our assets. We have some close to 200-year-old structures. We've got modern signalling, we've got 100-year-old signalling, we've got track, we've got earthworks, we've got telecoms networks, and they all have different factors that cause us to need to renew them. Some are literally life expired. Some are performance risk. They could last, but the failure pattern would increase. Some degrade, and therefore the risk of a safety incident, particularly with signalling, can be increased. And some relatively recent assets are now obsolete because of technology shift. So those are the factors that determine renewal activity. And what happens is every 5 years, the government sets out something called the SOFA, the Statement of Funds Available, and we then have to agree with the regulator what is an appropriate combination of renewals activities for within that fixed sum of money that the government's identified. And the regulator tests us to be efficient in that, and we agree a broad scope of work, actually quite a detailed scope of work, and then the regulator says, and we will expect you to do that plus extra, which you have to fund through being more efficient. And so that, if you like, is renewals activity. Enhancements then are things which, if you like, increase the capability or the quality of the network. An additional station, but even a platform extension, a line speed improvement, a new loop, a freight facility, even a new footbridge at a station. They're all in the enhancement budget. And that isn't part of that settlement that the regulator agrees with us. That is, funding for that is agreed as part of the comprehensive spending review with the Treasury issuing that typically on a 3-year basis. So they're very, very distinct pots of money. Now, sometimes when we're doing enhancements of projects, we will put in some renewals activity because it's a sensible way to do the work, and because if you look Transpenn Road upgrade, for example, we're not replacing all the track, but if it's a sensible time to renew some of it. But the funding is controlled very, very discreetly and distinctly. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So just a couple of specifics then on the back of that. In terms of the access for all projects, does that come from the kind of big settlement?
That's the enhancements.
An enhancement. Yes. And then similarly, where would the funding for the now cancelled Restoring Your Railways project have sat? And I guess where is that money gone, or that funding that did it exist, or what have you in the beginning?
So two things. They're both enhancements fundings because they add, they add scope or quality to the system. Access for All tends to come with a ring-fenced sum of money every 3 or 5 years. It's been around about £350 million for a 5-year period. So even though it's not part of the control period, the regulated sum, the government's chosen to do it over a 5-year period, which maybe has caused some of the confusion. But then programs like Restoring Your Railways would be funded out of the Comprehensive Spending Review settlement. Very, very occasionally they will come with additional money, but most of the time the assumption is that it'll be funded from the already agreed spending review provision. And that's where a lot of the uncertainty comes. Also worth saying, almost all of those schemes, including Restoring Your Railways, come with a bit of small print that says subject to business case. So just because they've announced doesn't mean that they will ever get funding. Network North was probably the biggest example of that, when there was an enormous list of schemes announced, but the small print said subject to business case, and most of those schemes, dare I say it, were never going to have a business case that would be acceptable.
And just drilling just slightly further level of detail before I hand over to somebody else. If as constituency MPs, there's a need for something specific in a constituency, so for example a platform extension, yep. What's the wait period? So if you sort of had a meeting with Network Rail and you said this needs to happen, which pot would it come from, and how long realistically might it take? And is there ever scope where there happens to be, £10,000 behind the sofa or something that can be thrown into creating a business case, for example?
So if it's an enhancement, then it comes from that DFT fund, so you'd need to get agreement support for that from the Department for Transport, not Network Rail. As I said, if in that circumstance we would say, well, actually the platform surface needs renewal anyway, so Network Rail can contribute, let's say a percentage of the cost, because we'll be doing works on site anyway, and that can make the money go further. But the regulator is very, very cautious about leakage from the money given for maintenance renewal into enhancements. There was a very specific example which the regulator poured over in Scotland with a platform extension of Mullinguy, which was designed to improve train service performance. And the regulator took a lot of persuading that this wasn't in practice enhancement, it was there for the operational benefit. Literally lots of meetings, lots of challenging questions to demonstrate that we weren't using the money inappropriately.
On the question of access for all, a relatively small amount of money, but hugely important to many MPs, including me.
Yes.
What's happened to it?
So, well, look, we've really got a grip to this year. We've had our probably best ever year. In the last 12 months, we've delivered 27 schemes, which is more, we think, than ever before. The previous financial year, it was best in 10 years. But dare I say it, I think the problem with it is severalfold. First of all, there is no strategy underpinning it, so it's not a strategy to develop
there wasn't a
an
rail
accessible
strategy.
railway.
Let's say it was probably a political strategy, but that's,
well,
that's
yes,
history
it tended
now,
to be.
Yeah.
So it tended
That's
to be
history.
have political priorities, if you like, determined the schedule. The second thing then is the stations that were always announced were never matched the funding available. So, some of the schemes, for example, are very extensive work. Some of them can be 30, 35, 40 million pounds because you need to put 2 new platform entrances in, you need multiple lifts, you need bridges. Clearly, if you're going to do one of those at 40 million pounds, then you're not going to be able to do all the others which are announced. So that it has a tendency to raise people's expectations when it's a capped sum of money. It also doesn't really facilitate match funding. Because of the way it's produced. So I think it's an area that's ripe for a more strategic approach.
So it's paused, not cancelled?
No, it's not cancelled by any means. We're still spending the CP6 money. There's a backlog there, and we've been asked to start the feasibility for CP7. We've not yet confirmed the funding for CP7 because it's part of the spending review, because it's enhancements. But the work is carrying on. We delivered 2 just last month. As I said, 27 in the last 12 months.
I think I'm particularly asking about the last list.
The feasibility list. So we've been given sufficient funding to do a desktop feasibility of those, which I think is a sensible approach, is to say, look, okay, on a desktop basis, how many of the 15 would you be able to do with the fixed funding available? And then do we want to progress with a subset of those rapidly, or do we want to keep all of them going but much more slowly, accepting that some might take 7 or 10 years before the funding is available?
It's helpful to have that clarification, because those of us who've been asking the questions since last July haven't been told that in so many words, so that's really helpful. Steph?
Thank you. Morning. Before I ask my main question, I guess if I could just get some clarification from you, because of course you said that renewals is a big part of the control period process, maintenance, operations, there's various other things, yes. Electrification is a little bit of that. But when you go into the control period process as a whole, are you wrapping up all of the DFT funded, the spending review funding stuff into that process? It's still the CP process is just the bits that are to do with renewals and that side of things.
Operations, maintenance, renewals is part of the control period.
Okay, so that's actually only a part of the works that are going on the railways.
And it may help if I give you a little bit of a history lesson why that split was made. What happened in the previous decade was when the projects that were being delivered were bigger, things like Great Western electrification, for example, the control period has fixed terms, and it's set out in statute when the regulator has to make certain decisions. So therefore, the budget for those big programmes was being fixed, sometimes when they were at a relatively immature state. So what happened in CP5, which was 2014 to 2019, is Network Rail ended up cutting back on its renewals activities to fund the overspend on the enhancements. Yeah. And one of the things the government said to decide at that time, Colette Bow did a review for the government and said, we think it's better to split out enhancements to stop the cross-contamination of enhancements overspend into operations, maintenance, renewals. It wasn't a problem all the time. We weren't spending much on enhancements because it was a relatively small subset. But as ambition for electrification, bigger stations, new lines grew, the risk of pricing those at a specific price point became too great. And that was then compounded by the reclassification of Network Rail. So that wasn't too much of a problem all the time that Network Rail could notionally just borrow more money from the markets. It was a problem for the taxpayer who was having to pay for it, but at least there was a funding stream. But when Network Rail was reclassified, the total sum of money was capped, and therefore the only way to continue with the enhancements was to rein in the renewal spend. And I think Treasury rightly said that's a dangerous path to be on in the longer term, because you're not investing in the core system at the rate you need to. And Jeremy, I don't know, you were there at the time. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
You were there at the tail end of that, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
Yes.
If I could just come in on your point about are they completely separate? No, they're not. So when you're planning renewals, you have to regard to what the enhancements in the future will need. So what you don't want is to deliver brand new infrastructure and all around it you've got assets that may be in a degraded condition. So we do look to align what we know about the future enhancements portfolio with the renewals as well. So that way you get assets coming into service where you've prepared everything. I wouldn't say it was perfect because you want to make sure you've done route strengthening. You want to make sure that you have got the assets able to perform. Sometimes that is an acceleration of a renewal. So what we try and do is anticipate based on what is known in terms of the enhancements pipeline.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose whether it's a railway network or a hotel, there is clearly a sense in having a separation of operationally from between stuff that's maintenance and stuff that's sort of big projects. I suppose what I'm interested in knowing is there's actually three subsets here, right? There's big projects, there's stuff which we're not allowed to do to make anything better by accident. It has to just be sort of like for like insurance claim type replacement, and then there's stuff that actually makes things better. Some people would argue you should only be replacing and repairing things in a way that enhances and improves them. But I wonder if generally, given everything we've heard so far, the access funding, these sorts of concerns and all these drifting parts and pots and promises, whether you feel the control period process itself is fit for purpose still.
I describe the control period process as a generous gift. There are very, very few parts of the public sector that have 5 years level of funding certainty. So it is not perfect by any means, but it is something that I think we ought to fight tooth and nail to keep. And if you like, I'm probably at danger of saying I want to cling to that. I don't really want to open it up bluntly, because I see more risk in opening it up. When you think of how many other parts of the public sector could say, here's secured funding for 5 years, my instincts are, let's keep it close and preserve it, rather than opening up the principle that may allow governments to change their priorities and say, well, we can intervene halfway through. Yeah. So it's,
I'm sure we'll delve in more into what happens within it in the course of the rest of this morning. Yeah. When it comes to the pipeline, though, and one of the bigger themes of this inquiry, which is around industry readiness and the view that industry has of what's coming down the tracks, that's inadvertent pun, can you tell us a bit about how you liaise with the supply chain as part of the control period process? How much visibility they have, how much planning and preparation, and perhaps also how that compares to the way in which you engage with the supply chain for centrally funded bigger projects, improvements, enhancements, that sort of stuff?
Well, I think ideally the supply chain want sight of the total pipeline, because some of our renewals activity on track, it's big. There's very heavy plant or signalling. You're looking for technology investment. And so they sometimes don't distinguish as much between renewals and enhancements. So they really want to see the end-to-end. Why? Well, because they want to plan their workforce. We want them to invest in technology, which means they need to comfort that there's going to be a return on that investment, because there's going to be a work stream to do it. Historically, we've not been very good at transitioning from one control period to the next, and because contracts were brought to an end at the end of year 5, as if there was never going to be any money for year 1. We've done rather better than that for the most recent control period. We've just started year 2. If I give you an illustration of that, we spent something like 19.2% of our 5-year settlement in the first year. So obviously if it was perfectly flat, it'd be 20%. Yeah. We were only 0.8 away from that. So in terms of that visibility, we've been fine. Where the supply chain have been really concerned is that 19.2% hasn't gone as far as it has in previous years, because we've seen very significant increases in inflation. Ballast, the rocks, if you like, the track is laid on, that's gone up by 80% since 2018. Concrete sleepers have gone up by 75% since 2019. Signalling costs have gone up by about 400 million over the last control period. So although we've given visibility of the work, it's not crystallising into as many orders as the supply chain want to have. And I think that's where we've not been good enough this time, is given them is translating what money means in terms of orders. We've contracted more of the work, but it's been fewer contracts than I think many of the suppliers were expecting. So where they're finding that they've now got grief, in some cases talking about workforce redundancies, it's not because we haven't smoothed the flow, it's because the value of the settlement has been reduced by what we know are 2 or 3 years of abnormal inflation.
Understand that. Anything else that could give the supply chain greater comfort?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're doing more on that. Jeremy, do you want to talk about the sort of things we've been doing?
Yeah, we try to engage them regularly and frequently, actually, in seeing the forward pipeline of work, the way that we contract with the supply chain using frameworks. So if you're a framework supplier, you may not know precisely what work you're going to get, but you can see that we've got an indicative spend profile, and therefore the work does flow, and that enables them to invest in the skills, the resources that they need to deliver, including equipment, but also the technology. And that forward visibility actually is really important to level plan the work as much as we can. So that gives them the best chance of delivering smoothly and efficiently. And we've got a very big efficiency program that we delivered last control period. That was up to 2024. We delivered £4 billion of efficiencies over a 5-year period, and we've got a very similar target for this year. And with the pressures that we've got around inflation, etc., that's part of the way that we deliver the additional work that the regulator expects us to deliver, given the cash funding, is by working very efficiently with the supply chain.
Just elaborate, probably the most significant change we made this year would be in our southern region, most of the railway south of the Thames, where we've effectively entered into a 10-year partnership, where we've said even though there's going to be a control period in the middle, we will give full visibility of the pipeline. We've got a strategic partnership which looks to embed that efficiency, but it's allowing the supply chain to be much more influential about how and when we plan work. And we're really testing that to see whether or not that's a model that could be used elsewhere. There are other utilities which have had good efficiencies as a result of that, and that would be transformational if we find that works.
And just, if I may, Chair, just on those efficiencies, does that mean you're face-to-face with them and crunching down on price, or is it that you're hoping that they can spread their interest across a longer, more certain period and drive costs down? Like, where are those efficiencies coming from within the operating model of the supply chain?
Well, as you'd expect, you look at it by various themes. You've got commercial. So yes, of course, price and competitive tension is important, but actually most of it comes from how do we run access to the railway. That's a big one. Right. What technology can you infuse to drive the cost down? Can you do work combination so that you only go in once? Yeah. So we've got a variety of methods that we use to drive it down. The other thing is what are you specifying? So we can't afford to gold plate what we do these days. So we've got a heavy focus on what we call minimum viable product. What is the minimum that we can do to deliver the outcomes that we want? And that creates some really interesting innovation from the supply chain as well about, are you on a no-build strategy, a low-build strategy, or a full rebuild? So there's plenty of engagement with the supply chain to deliver on the efficiency program.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, I think some people in the industry would have some slight issues with the 5-year control period. It's not exactly perfect, but Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Fairly straightforward question. Why has the rail network enhancements pipeline not been updated since 2019?
Well, at the risk of being controversial, I think because it's a flawed proposition. By which I mean the fact that it's owned politically and is therefore subject to shifting political priorities. It's not a strategy for the railway. And so what we see is, particularly at a time when there's more and more demand for things, a new politician will come in with wanting to do something new. Ms Smith mentioned restoring your railways, for example, and that just gets added to the list. But nobody wants to take anything off. So very quickly the numbers don't add up, and the easiest way to not expose that is to not publish the pipeline. That's about as straight as I can be.
No, that's very clear, very clear. So could I infer from your comments that you would really like to see a clear strategy for the railway from government and giving clear direction as to what it wants to achieve, strategically, not just in terms of, pet projects, or far be it for me to suggest any pork barrel project.
I very passionately believe that the railway is very good at doing certain things. I also am utterly convinced it's not the answer to every problem. And I think being very clear on what the railway is best at doing and having a prioritised list of interventions, be they rolling stock, be they additional staffing, be they technology, be they physical infrastructure. You don't have to commit all the funding to them. The pace at which you roll them out is obviously subject to broader political priorities. But being clear on where the railway adds most value and prioritising that list, I think would actually be better value for the taxpayer. I think we would deliver a better railway as a result, and the supply chain would have more confidence in the pipeline.
Thank you. In one of your earlier answers, you disagreed with the characterisation of boom and bust. But I think one area where the data clearly shows that problem has been in terms of electrification policy and delivery. So in that context, what lessons has Network Rail learnt from projects such as the Great Western electrification, which was mentioned earlier? And given OECD figures that show that Greece, the Slovak Republic and Hungary all have higher levels of electrified network than we do, is that not a real source of embarrassment and something we should tackle?
So, I contest that the overall spending level isn't one of boom and bust. When you add in the HS2 funds and Crossrail and TRU, I think it'd be factually inaccurate to suggest that there's been that we're going through a bust phase in any sense there. I mean, huge sums of money. There is absolute volatility in how that money is spent, and when it comes to electrification, what we had was almost a generation of no electrification. As a result, we didn't have a skilled base in the country that had optimised it. Our standards as Network Rail at the time turned out to be very, very risk averse and drove costs. Our contracting was quite immature, and then because of the political imperative, we ended up contracting too soon, and then bearing a lot of risk. We have now dealt with the majority of those issues. So our unit rates for electrification in Scotland now are very, very competitive internationally because we now have fit-for-purpose standards. We've got a good contractor that we've got a long-standing relationship with, and they optimise delivery. And so I think we've dealt with that issue, and we've got good means of contracting. In the meantime, electrification has dropped down the priority list in terms of political priorities. Partly, of course, because in a national decarbonisation strategy, the railway represents a very small percentage of our carbon budget, and therefore the incremental benefit you get from decarbonisation of the railway is not as great as you do for other parts of the economy. So that is a legitimate political choice. But what is it was beholden on myself and my colleagues is to make sure that we can deliver it affordably, and we've learned those lessons. I'm absolutely convinced we can demonstrate we have learned those lessons. And so if the government does want to spend on electrification, then we can deliver much more attractive unit rates now than we were able to when we were doing Great Western electrification 10 years ago.
Thanks for that. And final question in this section, and then I'll hand back to the chair. You mentioned that one of the issues with Great Western is that there hadn't been any electrification for a long time, so the art of how to do it was lost. Does that mean that you think a rolling program, a commitment to a rolling program of electrification would help supply chain and everybody to further reduce unit costs or manage them further?
I think that's almost incontrovertible. I think if you have a steady pipeline that allows you to optimise workforce, build in technology, minimise disruption, they're all three significant factors that would result in a lower cost overall. What I don't have to do is balance the books as Chief Secretary of the Treasury. So, but absolutely, if you want value for money for electrification, a steady, continuous pipeline is the most efficient way to deliver it. I think very few people would argue with that.
Thank you. 12 or so years ago, my predecessor, along with the community, was trying to do something about a derelict building, or set of buildings and land next to Kew Bridge Station. Turned out that Network Rail owned it, but they didn't know they did. So the rail system has considerable asset value. Are you doing enough to maximise opportunities for leveraging in private investment in infrastructure where there's opportunity for mutual gain, and particularly at urban stations?
So, I'll let Jeremy answer that, and maybe particularly think about how we're using private sector investment in telecoms, but also in terms of property.
Yeah, so on property in particular, we are now setting up a new property development company and combining Network Rail's property development team with London and Continental Railways, and that was announced in recent months. So we're on the way with that. London and Continental Railways is now part of Network Rail. And we've got a big ambition, actually, to build about 40,000 homes over the next 10 years using railway land and the new ability that we will have to acquire adjacent land so that we can mass. And therefore, I think, we've got some not just residential, but also commercial development as well. So we're very keen that for GBR in particular, when it comes, that the railway plays a full role in economic regeneration.
Would that include using air rights to build over railway lines?
Yes, absolutely, where it's economic. It's not often as opportunistic as you might think. It tends to be in very densely populated centres where the land values are high. So we're looking at how we redevelop around Liverpool Street Station at the moment. So that will go forward to City of London Planning Committee later in the year.
Okay, thank you.
I think in 2024 we were the 5th largest house builder in Britain. I mean, I think people don't understand just how much we do in this space. That doesn't mean there aren't many more opportunities, and we think that working with LCR we'll be able to make much more of those. But we 5,000 houses, I think, in 2024 meant that we were equivalent to the 5th largest house builder.
Can I come back on your point about private finance and private investment? So we look at where we've got assets that are not just core for the railway, but can be dual purpose. So if you take a look at our telecoms network and our fibre cable networks, there's an opportunity here to get the private sector to roll out the fibre cable, connect it to masting, to install antennae to boost railway signals, so that you get the ability to transfer not just data for the railway, but city-to-city data for new data centres. That's actually really quite attractive at the moment when you look at the amount of data movement that needs to be made across the country. And if you travel by train regularly, you'll know that quite often the telephone signal is just not fit for purpose. So this will also help us to fill in the not spots, as we call them, along the railway. So there are ways to bring private sector investment in, whether it's on land or other assets where there's a dual purpose. There is a problem where you want to invest in core infrastructure, where government is essentially the net funder, because that would then put it on the government balance sheet. So then you'd be competing for whether or not you want to invest in a rail enhancement driven by the private sector, and it helps. If you're bringing money to the railway, I think your case will get studied very carefully in terms of what it can do to offset it. So we do some that work financially, such as building new train depots, and obviously a big piece of the private finance investment in the railway is actually in rolling stock as well.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question on bringing in other finance. You explained in written evidence that producing a complete pipeline could create tension between giving industry certainty of public funding and encouraging private sector investment to deliver projects. How do we find the right balance?
I think what we want to avoid is committing to expenditure. Look, if you think, for example, of a new station where you may get a significant a contribution from a housing developer, then if you're too firm in the commitment to that, then you preclude opportunities for contributions. I think the way to do that is if you've got a long-term strategy that shows you the list of what you want to do, is to give the opportunity for private sector contributions to bump things up the list. So you're not committing to them regardless of contribution, but you can get that scheme escalated if there's a contribution. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Scott.
Thank you. Forgive my cynicism, but I can remember when the railways were privatised that it was said that the telecoms network would be a great asset which could be exploited. So it's good to hear we're getting there all these years later. So in terms of the boom and bust, and I know you don't want to call it boom and bust, but it does fluctuate. It has fluctuated quite a bit. So how much of that is down to these pesky politicians you were mentioning, and how much of that is actually down to maybe Network Rail not always making the right decisions within its own perimeter?
Well, look, we're a vast organisation. We don't always make the right decisions. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that we do. Every day is a school day at Network Rail.
When I look at the investment profile, it does seem to move in more or less 5-year cycles in terms of the rises and dips. And I know you said there's things cutting across that. But is that the only factor, or could you have planned better, perhaps, to even out that delivery? I'm talking about scale, not individual projects.
Look, if it's enhancements, as I said, that is absolutely prioritised by government because it's directly funded by the taxpayer, and the government decides what it wants to invest in. Does it want to go for electrification? Does it want to, does it want to focus on delivering Crossrail? Or does it want to spread a programme over 15, 20 years? Those are rightly political decisions. What we have to do is look at that statements of funds available every 5 years and say, do the circumstances change? So a good example of that would be climate change. We are broadly spending double what we spent last control period in this current period, and that was double in the previous period, because what we're seeing, and Scotland is at the forefront of this, we're seeing it as a reality. We're seeing far more frequent weather events, which means that we have to invest more in earthworks. So whilst in the current control period we're spending less on signalling, less on track, we're spending £400 million more on earthworks directly in response to climate change. So we do have to track those trends.
So how different would things be if politicians weren't meddling, and you had the same funding profile, and you were left actually to run the railway? How different would things be?
Look, you'll never find me suggesting that politicians are meddling. This is public money. We live in a democracy, and it seems to me entirely appropriate that politicians take decisions. All I'm suggesting is that
they make their own decisions.
No, I'm suggesting that if you have a strategic approach to that, you might get a better outcome for the taxpayer and the users of the system.
So it's not strategic just now. Then you think that's lacking?
I think successive governments, over the last 10, 15 years, have chosen not to have a rail strategy and be clear on what they want from the railway, and therefore to plan investment, be that in track or in train, that supports that.
Okay. And because I'm the token Scotsman here, I'll ask about Scotland. Is it any different in Scotland? Where I know you've got a different working relationship with
Absolutely. I think it would be fair to say that in Scotland there has been a much more strategic approach. The commitment to electrification, which is why we've had a continuous programme in Scotland. A commitment to expansion. But look, I think most latterly in Scotland, I think the funding pressures are now also coming to bear, and so they're having to look at the strategy. But I think what we'll see there is, as I suggested earlier, we may see some slippage in the timescale, but I don't see any sign that there's a fundamental shift in priorities. The commitment to decarbonisation, the commitment to reducing inequality. So I think Scotland is a good example of where we can demonstrate better outputs from the system because of a strategic approach.
Yeah, that's powerful. So the 5-year funding cycle, do you think, is that at the heart of the problem? Should it be longer? Would that help even out some of these bumps, these peaks and troughs?
I think 5 years, it's interesting. I was the aviation regulator for about 8 or 9 years, and that's 5 years. I think water, gas, electricity, they all tend to be 5 years. It's probably the sweet spot of being sufficiently long to give you some certainty. Beyond that, frankly, there are too many shocks. We've talked already about just how much inflation is hitting our current 5-year period. If you had to live with that for 10 years, that would be a very, very long period of time. And the minute you start then conceding the principle of opening up the settlement, I think you add real jeopardy to it. So I don't think there's a perfect number, but I think 5 years is a pretty good range.
5 years must be a stress for your external investors, but it must be a stress internally as well, because you must have to plan your workforce. And you're recruiting graduates, and by the time at the end of the 5 year period, that's when they're probably at their maximum, right? So
we overstate that.
Okay.
If you look at the actual volatility in spend over the last 10 or 15 years, most of that spend is predictable. The decisions on where we shift spend, they're not massive swings. And I think it's a fair criticism to say that historically we had artificial hiatuses at the start of new control periods, almost as if, as I said earlier, there wasn't going to be any money going forward. The level of spend will flex, but it doesn't flex by 40-50% year on year. And so there's a core piece you can plan. And that's why we're taking the decision, as I mentioned, with our southern contracting, to say, no, we're going to commit for 10 years. Because actually, a core of that activity we can be pretty darn confident will be funded over a 10-year period. I think we overstate the 5-year issue, and we sometimes compound
so for that 10 years, you're just looking at the base load, but you're expecting
yes, if you like,
to be funding above that. Okay,
that's a very good description. You've got a base load that you can frankly plan for way beyond 5 years.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
Sure.
If I could just add as well, I think this is where the regulated process really helps, because it gives real scrutiny over the asset management plans, and it starts well before the start of the 5-year period. So I wouldn't say it's quite a continuum, but certainly we're starting work 2 to 3 years before that settlement takes place. So you've got plenty of time for analysis and scrutiny and making sure that we're focusing the money in the right place. That then enables people to get comfortable with what they'll need to deliver it. I think the big thing for the supply chain is knowing how to size their workforce. So there is that decision point, which is important for them. But pretty much we are talking with them in great detail about what schemes and projects we want to run on the renewal side as well, so that they get that in mind.
So that's good, and of course the time it takes your suppliers to invest in stuff is also important.
Indeed.
So the regulator, is there a value in the regulator being outside the organisation looking in, or because that's about to change, isn't it?
Do you want to take that one?
I don't think any change is planned in terms of the funding settlement. The proposals under GBR is to change the regulator's role in terms of granting of access. That's quite a discrete set of powers.
Okay.
That's not affected. I think the government assigns value to a regulator that can scrutinise efficiency. There are other ways of doing it, but if the regulator comes as part of the package of a 5-year certainty of funding, then I think that's, to my mind, that's the prize, that's the jewel in the crown that we must preserve as we move into GBR.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, both. So, Andrew, you touched on this before, but some of our written evidence has highlighted the 2014 reclassification of Network Rail's debt as a possible reason for a reluctance to invest in the long term. Would you say that's a fair characterisation?
I don't think it is fair.
Okay.
In that it's not credible for Network Rail to say you can simply borrow and the taxpayer will pick up the bill regardless, because the taxpayer is the sole source of funds for that. Yes, it acts as a constraint, but I would argue that's an entirely legitimate constraint. If you're the Chief Secretary, the Treasurer or Chancellor, having a large public body that has unlimited ability to borrow money on the market seems to me to be not really sustainable. Jeremy was here at the tail end of CP5 when that transition was having an effect. I think where people misunderstand is the value of the treatment of the historic debt. That's funded separately, so it's not the debt that we carry that acts as the constraint. It's the fact that actually we are subject to the overall public borrowing. Jeremy?
Yeah, we don't bear interest rate volatility. For example, we've got a separate agreement with DFT and Treasury about how movements in interest costs are borne. I think in the past, the ability to go out and just borrow money and then the investments not appearing on the government balance sheet, it's a bit like having a golden credit card. It's not actually a great way to spend money. In terms of holding an organisation to account, it's much better to be clear about the funding that's available.
Okay, well, I don't think anyone's suggesting a golden credit card. I think, if it was off the books, different investment decisions might be made. So you might say in that case that this is a question for DFT or Treasury, but I am interested in your thoughts, if that's okay. Do you think the fact that the debt has in some ways gone onto the government's books is deterring the DFT from expanding the network because it has to go through the Treasury?
No, I don't think so, because enhancements were always funded by government anyway. It was... I don't believe it's having an impact directly. I think that there's more that we can do to take a look at how we can blend funding. So it's not just DFT or even Scottish Government funding, but money coming from mayoral combined authorities, other sources of funding that can actually help, I think, in the calibration of schemes, which ones to invest in. So I think there's more to go at in terms of broadening the funding sources.
Okay, so you would like to see some funding come from mayoral combined authorities?
Yes, I would. I think in some respects that enables them to have both a role in the decision making, which is what the GBR legislation sets out anyway. Okay. And I think as well, if you've got skin in the game, that really helps.
Would you agree with that, Sir Andrew?
Yes, I would. I think if you look at the status of transport for the North, for example, at the moment, it doesn't have any spending powers, and I think it puts that in quite a difficult position. But if I'm really honest as well, it allows authorities to make the case for things without having to cover the cost as well. So you end up with an artificial debate, whereas I think a degree of devolved funding where you transfer full accountability, I think actually has some real value in making those decisions, and there are genuine trade-offs to be made. And look, we've seen that, I think, work well in Wales and Scotland, and I think we've seen it work well in London, and we're seeing elements of that now develop in Manchester and in the West Midlands. So I think there's a model that can be made to work, yes.
Okay. As I don't think things are really working well at the moment. I mean, you only have to look at the North's crumbling rail infrastructure to see that after years of transport spending serving some regions rather than others, so many local areas, in my opinion, have been starved of much needed local investment. So do you think at the moment Network Rail is achieving the right balance between financial discipline and capital spending across the country as a whole? I mean, what you were saying in your previous answer would suggest that perhaps not.
Well, as I said, we don't choose where the enhancement spend goes. I mean, if you look at the state of the asset across the network, I think we don't see a reliability of infrastructure, for example, radically different in different parts of the country like that. We maintain that to a pretty standard level across the piece. What we're seeing is a system in parts of the country where there's a real demand for expansion of capacity, because historically there are always reduced capability of infrastructure and rolling stock, and demand is now stripping that capacity. But that's an enhancement decision. That's not part of our Network Rail allocation of resource. And look, I would say that Transparent Route Upgrade, a £10 billion a year programme, is transformational investment. Right the way from, particularly between Manchester and Leeds, but right the way through to York and Newcastle on the East Coast as well. And that is, that's a step change in capacity, in journey times, in reliability, in new trains, new depots, digital signalling, electrification, the like of which we've not seen in the north of England for probably 100 years. So I think that is a very strong commitment that has actually transcended change of government.
Okay, did you want to come in, Lawrence?
Thank you, Chair. It's a follow-on question about the effects of reclassification. You've both said that you don't think that it would be healthy to go back to the days of for want of a better phrase, borrowing against the regulated asset-based credit card. But reclassification had wider effects, including in terms of public accountability for Network Rail and the organisation's relationship with the central sponsor department and Treasury. So looking back but looking forward at the same time, what are the positives and negatives of that wider reclassification, and what lessons are there to be learned from that experience for the creation of GBR?
As I said, if we accept there's an inevitability that any Chancellor or Chief Secretary will want good levels of control over expenditure, I think what we saw immediately after reclassification was a very, very tight grip. And frankly, it's as much about relationship between the Treasury and the Department as it is between the relationship between Network Rail and DFT or Treasury. So the enhancement programme that was envisaged by Dame Colette Bowen, I think, when she put forward her proposals, didn't envisage that actually every single enhancement scheme was going to be subject to Treasury approval and scrutiny. And yet that's what we had really for 4 years, from 1919 right the way through to, I think, early 2024. The levels of delegation to the Department for Transport were very, very small. I literally don't think you could get approval for a footbridge without individual Treasury approvals. Mm-hmm. So that relationship, I think, is almost as significant as the relationship between the public body. The government has been very clear, both in its pre-election document, Getting Britain Moving, but also in its consultation document around the legislation for GBR, that it believes in the arm's length status of GBR. I think that is really important. Government is naturally cautious in its decision making. Departments are naturally and understandably risk averse, but we cannot optimise the system if very, very small decisions on timetabling, on very small increments of enhancements and balancing, track versus train, all end up being centrally controlled.
Presumably, having to have that very micro level of approval raises costs in some ways. Well,
absolutely, it adds prolongation, and if you've got a very big programme, and where you've got very significant overheads in the nature of the programme, then a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month delay can add millions of pounds to the cost of programmes. And this is not happening once in a programme's life, it can happen a dozen times in a programme's life.
And that's what's happened in practice over the last 4 years, in at least some cases.
In some cases, there's definitely been delay as a result of the multiplicity of approvals processes. Yes, now, in the last 18 months or so, there's been some delegation back to the Department for Transport, which has helped with the smaller schemes. And as I said, I entirely accept that there needs to be accountability for expenditure when you're using taxpayers' money, but doing that in a streamlined way, I think, is a really important part of holding GBR to account.
Thank you.
I'd say there is quite a distinction between renewals, where really we are given our 5-year funding settlement and we have the agreed work plan with the regulator, and that rolls itself out very efficiently. On the enhancements, I would say there is a benefit of phased release of funding, because in the past, if I go back to CP5, major schemes were committed to before the cost of them was properly understood, and the deliverability of them, therefore the value for money of them for taxpayers. Now the process we went through that Colette Bow proposed works extremely well, in that we go through a process. It can be time consuming, but it does mean that before you get too far into a programme, you've fully understood what you're going to deliver. And for the supply chain as well, that's really useful when you've got detailed plans and scope and time scales. That reduces risk.
Okay, thank you. Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. Following on from Lawrence's question and looking to the future, do you think unifying track and train under Great British Rail will provide the basis for a clearer investment pipeline?
Very much so.
Okay.
Why? Well, I think because GBR will be tasked with developing a strategy that's consistent with political objectives, but it allows us to determine what's the best solution. For example, in many cases, people rush to infrastructure, which is expensive and long planning timescales, when actually changes to rolling stock can be a better solution for passengers. It allows us to optimise how we use access to the network much more effectively. It allows a guide in mind for timetabling, then to realise the benefits. I think there are very many ways in which GBR can allow the railways to deliver more efficiently when it comes to an enhancement pipeline.
And I've just got a quick supplementary, is that all right on that one, if I may? So I'm moving away from rolling stock slightly, but to do with expansion of the network. Under GBR, could decisions around where to invest be linked more closely then to development? So, for example, in my constituency of Harewood and Middleton North, we've got the Atom Valley Mayoral Development Corporation, which is expected to create 20,000 new jobs. What do you think could be the mechanism for supporting network expansion where there's greater levels of development?
So I said, look, I think it all has to be nested overall in the overall political support and strategy for what the railway does best. But as I said, if you've then got a list of schemes, if you look at how it works in London, for example, which I think is a pretty good model, the London Transport Plan identifies the things that the mayor believes over a 10, 15-year period we should invest in. What it does then is say, okay, it allows third-party contributors to say, I'm going to nudge that scheme up from, say, number 7 to number 5 by a contribution, because there's transparent commitment to it as a transport initiative. But what you do is you increase the ability to get it delivered by additional funding. And I think that level of transparency and consistency of intention that can bridge elections, I think, and not just elections, but changes of Secretary of State, I think is really important and powerful, and allows private investors to have some confidence that there's stability in that. The London Transport Plan, I think, has been remarkably stable across a Labour, Conservative, Labour mayors. For 3 mayors, actually, it's withstood that because there's a transport logic to it. And I think that's really helped when it's come to investments in Crossrail and indeed other investments.
Interesting, thank you.
And a wider regeneration
Absolutely.
and growth
Yes.
policies as well. Yeah. Rebecca, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just on that, one of the things we often find is that London, Manchester, Birmingham get kind of held up as the mayoral authorities that have that ability to do that planning. As we head forward with the devolution bill alongside the Great British Railway work, how realistic is the work that could be done on those smaller mayoral authorities? So I'm an MP in Devon. There might be, heaven forbid that I say this publicly, but we could end up with a Devon and Cornwall mayor. That's quite a small piece of the jigsaw in terms of the infrastructure of the railway system across the country. How replicable is what happens in those big mayoral authorities going to be in the smaller new mayoral authorities that the government wants to set up around the country?
Well, I'm going to take my life in my hand and give you a Cornish example. Actually, if you look at Cornish Metro currently...
So Cornish Metro has not been done under the plans for what's going ahead with devolution?
No, but it is a good example of local investment and and being able to galvanise and bump things up the priority list. I think that's where it's a good illustration.
How does Network Rail connect in with that?
Well, because look, we work within a political construct, and if we can demonstrate that by working with local developers or through grant funding from local authorities, we quite regularly bump things up the list because of alternative sources of funding. From simple things like a contribution to a footbridge, to a new station, to increase capacity, we do that quite regularly. And I think what the devolution bill does and the statutory duty which is envisaged in the GBR bill, it just formalises that and gives transparency, and that's why I think some degree of funding devolution then is helpful, because it allows people to make some informed choices.
Alex, did you want to come in here?
Next question.
11.
We're on, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've already touched to some extent on devolution. Can you explain, first of all, to what extent investment decisions are being made with any regional input at the moment, and then whether you think going forward, as we get more mayors, as we've heard, and potentially a regionalised GBR structure, what you think the challenges and opportunities are for that?
I'll start off and then maybe bring Jeremy in. Look, I mean, the most obvious example, and it's not a region but a nation, Scotland has an entirely ring-fenced funding settlement for both maintenance and renewals, and indeed for enhancements. So it's the most extreme example of that. But it's the rest of it tends to be, dare I say, slightly ad hoc because it's absent the overarching strategy. But it's determined, if in terms of enhancements, by political decisions on how to spend the money that's available. So Transpennine Route Upgrade is a good example because it's such a big programme over an extended period of time. There are opportunities to work with regional authorities on enhancements to that in their localities, and we do some of that, but it's quite marginal. Jeremy's been working very actively in Leeds with authorities there. You've been personally sort of chairing with Leeds to build the case in Leeds, for example.
And I've been working with Leeds now for about 6 years around the regional development, the station development, and there's been really great alignment between West Yorkshire Combined Authority, Leeds City Council, watching them come together there with their plans, and not just railway plans, but how it fits into a multimodal transport solution. That has meant that the strategy has a coherence that you don't get if you just look at it in straightforward railway-only terms, heavy rail terms. You know, looking at the impacts of active travel, how we're going to move and store bicycles around the station, the integration with a tram system. All of these things, to me, show that when you've got that nested in a regional growth plan as well, you're getting transport and the infrastructure to do what it's supposed to do, which is help the city grow. So I think it's been a great case study, actually, about how to continue to engage no regrets decisions over 6 years, and Leeds continues to move forward.
In other authorities, for example, they've decided to build the stations themselves. So the West Midlands Mayoralty, on what's called the Camp Hill line, 4 new stations, they're being built and funded by the combined authority, whereas we're doing infrastructure works to support it. University Station, that was fundamentally transformed, was developed and delivered by the combined authority again. So we are remarkably flexible in how we engage in that regard, depending on where the sources of the funding are and what makes sense. The Northumberland line, which opened back in December, was effectively funded and managed by Northumberland County Council, and we did some of the essential rail infrastructure works, but I think we were about 25% of the overall budget. Most of it was managed by them. We try not to be territorial because we've got plenty of things to do and we know we're not the answer to every problem.
Do you feel that the advent of there being more mayors is going to make it more strategic? Or is there a danger that actually a mayor has got a fairly defined geography and actually railway lines tend to run through them, normally all the way to London?
There is a definite tension and trade-off to be worked through there. And as a relatively advanced mayoral authority, Greater Manchester is a good example of that, where commuting in Greater Manchester is served not just by trains in Greater Manchester, but trains that come from Wales, that come from Norwich, that come right the way through the country. You know, the core commuting into Manchester comes from a very distributed network. So what we're working with Andy Burnham's team there is working at, well, where could the mayor have more control and leverage over certain lines, whilst respecting the fact that the network characteristics means that GBR will need to have overall supervision to make the overall system work, because if you don't do that, then actually the people of Manchester are not going to be well served. So it needs us to be prepared to work pragmatically and very closely together, because you can't have artificial demarcations, and it's very different. Manchester is uniquely complicated because of the way that Manchester city centre is served by such a diverse group of people.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. So going back to what an ideal investment pipeline might look like, avoid calling it rail investment pipeline because it has an unfortunate acronym. You've both said already that you think that the 5-year period, or Sandra, I think you said that the 5-year period is probably about right. Some of the organisations that have submitted written evidence have said that they would like to see a 30-year statement of intent around major projects, with subsequent 5-year investment periods being initially sketched out. So you've still got that first part set in stone to an extent, but with some degree of certainty about the subsequent periods. Do you think that that would be a positive step for the industry?
Yes, I mean, hopefully that's consistent with what I was talking about, having a clear rail strategy. The 5-year window is about the detail of renewals and maintenance, where you have a high level of certainty and predictability to the point where you can contract. Because I think what supply chains want is they want some visibility, but ultimately they want contracts. And I think it's not plausible to contract for 30 years, and I don't think anybody's advocating that. But I think if you can contract for at least 5 years, in some cases if you can contract for 10 years on the base load, as Dr. Arthur described it, then I think you've got a good blend. But if you want confidence in sustained investment on an efficiency, for example on electrification kit or new technology, then I can entirely understand why the supply chain wants more than 5 years confidence in utilisation. These are quite exclusive assets. You can't use a railway vehicle on many other places. They're not things you can just. It's not like it's not a truck that you can move anywhere around the world or anywhere in the country. Railroad vehicles have a very bespoke role, so it's entirely understandable why people want a longer term for that enhancement strategy.
Yes, and I think going back to one of my colleagues' points, up to a point, you need to know what the long-term enhancements pipeline is likely to look like in order to plan out renewals and maintenance around those projects. Thinking about rolling stock as well, how, from an infrastructure management perspective, how should rolling stock investment be incorporated into infrastructure planning?
Well, I think if you look at the history, you would say it hasn't been that well integrated. So if there is boom and bust, first of all, a lot of it has been around rolling stock, where you have sudden surges of demand for new trains and then nothing, and then you've got 4 train factories in the UK, all of them struggling with workload at the moment. So when we're planning out our network investment programme, having a really strong linkage between the rolling stock and the infrastructure is vital. And in the past I've seen it where the infrastructure could be ready too soon, the rolling stock could arrive too early, and you end up looking at the sub-efficiency that's there in terms of how you plan it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring this together with an overarching strategy, and that will provide, just coming back to some of the points you've made today, the evenness of investment profile, the certainty it's giving to the supply chain, not just infrastructure supply chain, but also rolling stock builders. And you've got then linking that with the renewals, I think you've got a great combination there, which says that you could deliver even better value for money.
Okay.
Thank you. And last question in this group. We're all waiting for the government's wider industrial strategy. What role should the development of a long-term plan for the railway play in the development of that wider government strategy, including for supporting the UK's industrial base and infrastructure assets?
Well, I think we can play quite a significant role. For me, the big breakthrough really is around technology, and that applies both to renewals and maintenance activity, but also to enhancements as well, and sustaining the technology shift is one of those areas where the railway has barely scratched the surface yet, and understanding the extent to which the sustained government support for that technology shift, I think, is going to be really, really critical to delivering efficiencies in the next 5 and 10 years. And look, fragmentation of the system has really held us back in that regard in terms of investment horizons, but the track-train divide, the inability to guarantee that you'll be able to realise the return on investment. All of those things, I think, if we sort those through GBR and we have a clear, coherent industrial strategy, I think, puts us on a much stronger footing.
Would you say we're behind the curve compared to other countries on technological adoption?
I think all of those factors has meant that in certain areas that's absolutely a factor. Not everywhere, but on simple things like ticketing, that's manifested to anyone who travels across the network. In Europe, or never mind much more globally, we'll see that we are very much behind the curve in that regard.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question from me, Sir Andrew. You're retiring from Network Rail in October after 7 years. What do you think your legacy will be, and particularly around the changes to Network Rail's regional structure?
Wow.
Briefly.
I'm trying not to think about it. If I
okay.
Look, I mean, I returned to the railways after 9 years in aviation, convinced of the need for a different structure and model. And I'm very proud of the fact that we've managed to sustain the concept of Great British Railways through. We're now on our 5th Prime Minister in my 7 years, and actually for all of them to be accepting the need for track and train to be joined up together, I think is fundamental. I've been around long enough to have seen the railway broken up, and there was real benefits in a privatised, fragmented structure. All the time we didn't have capacity constraint. But all transport planning and economics demonstrates that when you've got congestion in your system, you need to optimise the network. You can't just throw more money at it to get more return. And I think if I've helped sustain the case for Great British Railways through a time of unprecedented political upheaval, I think that is then that's something I'll be proud of.
Thank you very much, and thank you. That brings our first panel to an end. Thank you for all your evidence and the time you spent preparing for today, and if there's anything you felt you'd like to add, please do write. I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few minutes while our next witnesses take their places at the table. This sitting is suspended. Welcome to our second panel. So could I ask you each to introduce yourselves, starting over to my left?
Craven-Faulkner. I'm Vice Chair of the Rail Forum, and I'm also a partner at Shoesmiths.
Good morning, Elaine Clark, Chief Exec of the Rail Forum.
Good morning, Noel Travers, Chair of the Rail Industry Association and also Chief Executive of Buckland Rail Group.
Good morning, I'm Robert Cook. I'm Policy Director at the Railway Industry Association.
Thank you very much. So, how would you all characterise the system for rail investment in Great Britain, and how has this developed over time? I'll start with Michelle.
It's incredibly fragmented, and we've already heard Sir Andrew pointing out the reasons why. I mean, the separation between rolling stock and track, and the fact that there needs to be a little bit more alignment there. But then also looking at the way that the control periods are modelled, whilst we recognise the importance of having the funding stream and that is different to other public sectors. The way that money is then released by way of contracts has led to a really difficult period of time for the supply chain, in particular in this most recent control period, where we've, from the Rail Forum point of view, we've had members tell us it's the worst that they've ever seen it. This is leading to redundancies and businesses closing at the moment because there isn't that certainty of work. So I think in terms of looking to the future and looking at what GBR can perhaps bring along for us, some level of certainty, increased certainty in whatever that looks like, is going to be really imperative to maintain the supply chain, if nothing else.
Okay, thank you. And without repeating what others have said, Elaine, anything to add?
Yeah, so if I just focus on the renewals spend profile, and we've heard from previous witnesses, the 5-year and the benefits of the 5-year cycle. What the 5-yearly cycle doesn't necessarily show in its totality is the sawtooth of annual spend within that. So it's quite volatile across that 5-yearly period. And what the 5-year periods do is put a fracture, an artificial fracture, in the spending profile for longer projects or indeed renewals generally. So it has benefits, but it has its challenges.
No.
Firstly, it's nice to start off with, I fully agree with most of what Sir Andrew and Jeremy had to say, and also what Elaine and Michelle have had to say. I've got almost 37 years in the industry, and I think Sir Andrew characterised it with a contraction initially and then periods of... I don't agree with them in that there hasn't been boom and bust. There absolutely has been boom and bust across the piece. But what we're experiencing at the moment is way beyond anything I've experienced in my career. And that's down to a number of factors. It's down to the rail reform programme, the bringing on Great British Railway and the impact that has on those that may be affected around that. It is down to the start to CP7 being particularly difficult, which has actually been caused by the end of CP6 being also particularly difficult. And also the devolution within Network Rail to the routes and regions has created a degree of uncertainty. And for clarity, I completely agree that rail reform is right and the devolution is right, but what hasn't been considered is the impact that those things have had on the industry's ability to spend its money effectively and efficiently.
Thank you. Robert?
I would agree with all of that. And to just build on it, I've brought 3 charts along for the committee. We have a sort of long-term trend of Network Rail renewals, which is since privatisation through to the current control period. You can see sort of significant spikes as we go through that. On rolling stock, this goes back to 1988 up to 2024, and you can see the volumes of investment across years fluctuating very widely. And finally, on electrification, the green bars show the UK electrification volumes. And you can see the drought that Sir Andrew referred to. The red line reflects German levels of electrification over a similar 30-year period, which they delivered for significantly lower cost. So the point I would stress is that we've had this, has been for a number of years, we have it across lots of different asset types, and as others have said, it's been particularly acute recently for reasons that we could get into.
Thank you very much. Well, I remember rightly, the German electrification was delivered at something like a quarter the cost per kilometre of track than...
I think it's roughly 1/3 cheaper, I think, is our assessment.
Than UK electrification. Okay, thank you. We'll probably delve into detail in some of these issues in later questions, but just very overarching. If you do accept, which I think you all do, that industry has seen boom and bust approach to railway investment, in top-line summary, what effect has this had on the businesses you represent? I'll start with Robert.
I think, we're seeing reports from companies right across the sector, providing very different types of services that they are struggling at the moment. The top line, I think, evidence, if you go to the National Skills Academy for Rail, is the annual workforce survey that they ran. And in October, I think, last year, they published it showing that there'd been a 9.4% shrinkage in the rail workforce, which is extraordinary. That's actually corroborated by surveys that we run, which are independently carried out by Oxford Economics, that look at the number of people employed in UK rail. That similarly shows there's been a very significant decline, around about 9% in the workforce. And the other bit I would stress in the top line is we have an annual survey of business confidence. And in the autumn, 83% of companies were saying they were expecting to see a hiatus in the year ahead. Now, that's been declining over the last 5 years. So whatever the reasons, the impact on companies is significant uncertainty.
Okay. Anything to add, Noel?
Yeah, look, I think it's very clear to also make the point that from a perspective of running my own businesses, boom is not much better than bust, although given the choice I would take the boom part of it. And that's because the challenges that we have as an industry in putting the right skilled resources when you're in a period of boom means that you become much less effective at delivering your the projects or products that you're looking to deliver efficiently. So boom brings its own challenges and needn't be forgotten. I was with Bombardier, it's now Alstom, at a time that it entered a very, very significant period of boom that Rob's chart demonstrated. And that brings a whole new set of problems to you. And the last thing that we as an industry want to do is recruit huge swathes of people just to let them go a year or two later because we're actually going into one of the down periods.
Thank you. Elaine?
First of all, I would absolutely agree with what Noel and Rob have said, and specifically around Rob's comments, the work that RIA does on their survey. We also do surveys of our members. We did a survey back in October, and we recently followed that up with some telephone conversations with the companies that responded to that. And of all the years I've been in my role, which is 8 years now, it's the lowest level of confidence that we've ever had reported from across the supply chain, from large companies and small companies, regardless of the types of services that they're offering. But to answer your question a little bit more in detail around what challenges does it provide and problems it causes for the companies, it does cause difficulties with recruitment decisions. Companies don't know what they need to recruit, as in what type of individuals, how many people, even where they need to recruit them in terms of locations. That doesn't just apply to new people, it's also development of their existing people. It puts companies off investing in those people because they're not quite sure where they're going to be, whether they're needed in the future. I think Sir Andrew referred to investment in technology. Technology on the railway can be quite expensive. Those big road rail vehicles don't come cheap, and they can't be redeployed very easily. So companies are reluctant to invest if they're not sure when they're going to get that return on investment. And there's the obvious impact then on efficiency, productivity, etc. And I think the last point I'd make is that SMEs find that particularly challenging. And the analogy that I tend to use is that if you drop a stone in a pond, the big tier ones near the centre can often weather that storm because they're big enough and they're perhaps diverse enough to be able to cope. But as you get further out towards the edge of the pond, the SMEs are the ones that will get capsized by those ripples. And I think it's really important that we remember that impact of those waves is that much greater on the SMEs.
And I think somebody's evidence said that in those times, the big companies in-source work that they would otherwise give to a contract with SMEs, and hence
it's a double whammy then for the SME.
Yeah. Okay, Michelle.
Obviously, I agree with everything that's been said, but I do just want to pick up on another area that we also see not happening, which is the innovation side of things. Because of the uncertainty, because of the lack of clarity, we're not getting the investment or the development to bring about innovation. I've just spent 18 months working with the Rail Supply Group on the Innovation Charter that is due to be launched soon, imminently. And the whole point of that is trying to get the industry to come together to agree the benefits of innovation. There are some real challenges there within the sector. There's some real barriers to innovation. One, because of this uncertainty when it comes to the spend and where the spend's going to go. Second is the clarity as what it's going to actually be for. What does the industry want? What is the sector looking for? So there's all of these reasons why people aren't going and innovating. And then the final reason why innovation isn't happening is quite often when specifications come out, they are so prescriptive that there's no room for innovation. So we're really missing a trick then when it comes to the efficiency side of things. There are cost benefits that we could be seeking and developing, but there just isn't the scope to do that.
Thank you, that's useful. Rebecca?
Building on what you've just said already, I think thinking solely about infrastructure renewals, is the control period system fit for purpose? And it sounds to me like you may not think it is, but it would be interesting to know what each of you think about that. Shall I start with Michelle?
I think it's a difficult one. We need to almost separate it out in the same way that Sir Andrew did. To kind of break open the system now could be catastrophic for us because we need some money coming in to the industry. But the fluctuation in the way that money is spent over the 5 years is what's causing the significant difficulty. So since CP7 started, the amount of money that has been spent, whilst money is being spent, is largely still hangover from CP7. And then there's all the instances that Sir Andrew mentioned about, well, you know, we've got inflation and this, that and the other, which is impacting things. I think there's so many different references to so many different things. We've got the control period, we've got RNEP, we've got, do we need a strategy? We just need some clarity and some transparency in whatever form that looks like it, and some certainty to enable investment. There's not many businesses that would go and invest millions of pounds on new technology if they've only got the forward sight of 5 years. So whether we need to have that separation out between the funds, which is what within the control period, and then the strategy side of things, I think that's what would help. So without turning around to the Treasury and saying we need money for the next 30 years and here's our wish list, actually saying this is what we need over the next 5 years, but actually these are some of the things that we'd like to do with it to give some certainty to the supply chain.
I think in general the control periods, they're a good thing. 5 years just give us some degree of certainty for planning, etc. But as we've already said and the graphs show, there is a big swing in some of those spends. There's 30% plus year on year in some of those years. And I think the other point I would make is that we talk about a 5-year visibility. That's not actually true. Companies only get 5 years visibility at the very start of a control period. By the time you get to year 3 and 4, that visibility is down to probably 12 months. So because there is this artificial cliff edge at the end of a control period planning process, which is one of the reasons why we believe that the 5 years is a good base to work from, but it could be improved if we had a 5, say, plus 2, where there was much better planning for 2 years so that we didn't have that cliff edge or that artificial break between control periods, so it was a smoother transition between the two.
I'd like before...
I mean, you don't need to answer every question unless there's anything specific you want to add.
I'd like to add something to something you said a little bit earlier. It's not just the tier ones and the large contractors that in-house workload when it's a downturn or there is a reduction in work. Network Rail do that as well. So the first place that work goes is to make sure that Network Rail staff are fully employed. And that then magnifies the impact on what is passed on to the tier ones and then hits the SMEs even more. And in terms of the control period, first of all, as an industry, we actually feel we are pretty lucky to have a 5-year funding statement. So the CP, the 5-year control period, is not the challenge in itself. It is entirely about how it is managed. It's entirely about how the spend is profiled throughout that, and the graphs demonstrate that very ably.
Just a very specific point on that. Under the proposed rail reform legislation, there's a line in the consultation document that says in future there may be mid-period reductions to funding available. And I think we'd be really keen to avoid that situation in whatever is being set up. I think we've seen a slightly different model for highways in terms of the way the intent was a 5-year control period, but what that legislation has actually resulted in is currently a 1-year funding process for highways and delays to when actually you were going to expect to see the beginning and end of those control periods. So I think that's something for rail really to watch and not to emulate that model.
Could I just add a point there as well? Is I think what's going to be interesting when we get to the next control period is how the requirements under the Procurement Act are going to play into that as well, because obviously there's the requirement for the 6-month forward planning and the 6-month announcements to be made, and how that's then going to be rolled into CP7. I don't think we've had clarification yet from Network Rail as to how that will be kind of brought together.
Okay, thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. We heard from our last panel of witnesses that the rail network enhancements pipeline was a flawed proposition and not a strategy for the railway. Would you agree with that, and what purpose do you think it currently serves?
Well,
I'm happy to go on that.
Go for it.
I fully agree with that. The fact that it hasn't been updated in 7 years, and something that we at RIA and also our colleagues at Rail Forum have campaigned on for it feels like forever, is a demonstration of that. It is, Sir Andrew is absolutely right, it has become subject to political input. We are a democracy, and local decisions are made based upon local investments in terms of elections, and therefore there is always going to be a desire for your piece of work or your enhancement or your upgrade to be made in your local constituency, because that is then going to give the politicians the best chance of getting elected. And therefore, when things are removed from an enhancement plan, because they have fallen down the pecking order, as there should be a pecking order, there should be decisions on each project, then that has a very significant impact in terms of the political view against the department. And so the department has understandably been reticent to produce anything, but we as an industry do need a long-term plan. We don't need long-term commitments. I think that's a really important point to make, but we do need a plan so that we can see where investment is going to be made to meet an even long-term strategy that should be set from government. And we can start to plan, recruit, invest, train to meet some of those commitments if they're coming against a long-term plan.
I might just add that I think it's really important to stress the RNEP is never supposed to be a complete promise about all the schemes. It's supposed to give visibility to companies of exactly what stage the different schemes are at. So it's having the early visibility of, is there a project here that somebody's taken a decision to start developing? Are we going to start the design work? That's a different judgment from are you going to complete the project. And you'll have suppliers at different stages of the project getting involved. And often it's at those very early stages where you're talking about design choices that will make a huge difference to value for money or passenger experience. So you want to get suppliers in early. Currently what we're seeing, I think, is only information much later in the day rather than that steady all the way through the process. Where are you in your current development?
So in principle, do you think it's a good idea if it were updated, or would you scrap the whole thing?
No, absolutely. I think it's an excellent idea if it's updated, current, and reflective of what is really likely to happen rather than what is just a long list of wishes.
Now, there's also a Network Rail's Enhancements Delivery Plan published quarterly. Do you think that gives certainty to industry?
This plan, I think we were looking at this. We don't think it's actually published quarterly in practice. We think it's quite a bit more sporadic. The introduction to the documents is very clear that on its limitations. It says milestones will only be published in this plan once a scheme has passed final investment decision. In other words, it gives you none of that early visibility. It might be of use if you're a train operating company or a freight truck company trying to anticipate where there will be future capacity to run your trains. But if you're a supply chain company actually trying to bid into the work, it's not going to give you that. There's a Scotland plan, which is somewhat better in that it gives earlier visibility of what's happening with projects and gives a proposed or agreed status, so you've got a bit more nuance. But that doesn't include values and is about 3 years old. So we're not getting visibility through those at the moment.
May I say that? And we would absolutely agree with what Rob just said. It doesn't provide a great deal of value. If you look at the current published plan, there's 33 projects on there, 8 of which are complete, and a third of the 33 are under change control. So that doesn't give you any confidence of what's going to happen next. But if I can come back to your original point around the RNEP and whether it has value, I think the answer is yes, it should have, but for the reasons we've heard, it doesn't at the moment. And if I may quote from the original RNEP publication, which is a good few years old now, it says, our intention is for more enhancements to be promoted, funded and or financed by a range of parties. For example, the Transforming Cities Fund, local enterprise partnerships, subnational transport bodies, local authorities, metropolitan mayors and the private sector. To meet our ambitions of a growing rail network built by and for a diverse range of stakeholders, it's ever more important that government provides clarity and certainty over how projects are moved forward and what railway users can expect. Now, recognising that some of those fundings, etc., have moved on, the basic premise of what that is trying to achieve, I think, still holds and is still really important, and arguably even more important with devolution, where we've heard already from previous witnesses around some of the tensions, I think was the word used, that will probably come about with that national versus local sort of prioritisation. And as Noel was saying, we're not suggesting that we should have a 10, 20-year budgeted set of projects. Companies work with pipelines all the time. They have their own business pipelines. Some have a higher degree of certainty than others. It's the same sort of concept. So really what we're asking for is normal, good business practice.
Okay, Alex.
And then finally in this section, do you think that funding for enhancement should be reintegrated into the control period process?
I think if I pick up on that one, I think if it's certain of the lower level things, the smaller value things, then absolutely there's various reasons why that should be the case. Not in least if somebody's doing something on a station and there's some enhancement work that needs doing, let's get it all done at the same time rather than being done by two different teams at two different times. I think the risk of incorporating the larger enhancement work into the control period funding package is that just the potential for delay, the amount of time it would take, the amount of further additional scrutiny, which is absolutely right should take place. I just think it would cause delays on an already delayed programme. To include something, for example, like HS2 within the enhancement programme, I just think would just cause unnecessary bother.
Okay, shall we move on? Okay, Elsie?
Thanks.
Yeah.
So in its written evidence to us, the department said that providing a medium to long-term period of schemes or strategic outcomes would be a challenging ambition in times of uncertainty. From the organisations that I speak to, including figures across the local authority in and around my constituency and in Greater Manchester, what they obviously want is more certainty, not less. And obviously I'd love more certainty about some long-term projects like potential stations in my constituency. Is industry being realistic given the current fiscal situation? And do you envisage a point where we can begin to talk in the medium and long term again with a bit more conviction?
I think we are being realistic because we're not asking for a 20-year budget. We're asking for a fixed 5-year funding, which we have, but better spent, better profiled. But importantly, overarching that, what we're asking for is a long-term strategy to give that clear route map, if you like, that sets out, what is the purpose of the railway? What are we here to deliver? We're not here just to look shiny and new and a pretty set of rails and some signalling equipment. We're here we have a purpose. It's about moving people and goods around the country. So what is that clear sense of purpose? Where do we fit within an integrated, modern future, decarbonised transport network? What is the role that government wants the railway to play over that long 20-year period of time? That strategy doesn't cost, other than somebody to actually develop it, it doesn't cost huge amounts of money. So we're asking for that clarity of where are we heading, backed by, say, a 10-year plan of what are the things that will help us to get there? What are the projects? What are those enhancements? What do we need to do on the railway to move us in that direction? Backed by that fully funded 5-year plan. So I don't think we're asking for anything massively difficult. It's about that vision. And I think a key point to me is it's about having a vision that helps us to drive our future as a railway, to drive a positive future for the railway and the contribution it can make to the economy, rather than what at the moment feels very reactive.
If I may add to that, I completely agree with everything that Elaine said. We'll have to stop saying that because we agree with everything so far. As an industry, we've never asked for more money. We would love more money, but we do not campaign for more money. What we really want is the significant sums that are being invested in our industry to be spent efficiently and effectively. We fully understand, and I think that electrification is a perfect case in point. The ability to deliver projects in a value for money way and effectively requires us to take a long-term view and a long-term steady view. So the level of funding that's there is absolutely fine. It's not a problem. We just like it to be spent properly. And there is a nuance to how money is spent. And Sir Andrew and Jeremy talked about overall levels of expenditure being at a reasonably steady level with small fluctuations. What sits below those numbers is how the money is spent in different types of activity. And if you break things down into track, into signalling, into electrification, every one of those disciplines sees huge shifts year to year, and particularly over a 2 or 3 year period. And it's those shifts that hurt the supply chain more than anything else. So this is not about quantum of spend. It is about looking at how we spend that money to make sure that we're getting the greatest value for money out of it and the most out of the supply chain that just wants to do a good job.
Okay, thank you. This maybe one more for panel members from the RIA. You say in written evidence that companies typically need about 3 years of certainty of work in order to invest in apprenticeships and graduate schemes. Why are 5-year control periods and funded enhancement commitments not sufficient?
So there's a couple of points to that. First of all, Elaine made a very, very good point earlier on that a 5-year commitment is only a 5-year commitment at the start of a 5-year period. What we want to be able to do is to be able to offer apprenticeships and training programs when we've got a degree of certainty that there's going to be a role there for the employee at the end of that. It's a challenging enough world out there for youngsters, even though apprentices can be, for people of my age nowadays even can do apprenticeships. When you're recruiting, when you are investing significant sums in the people that we need to do, you want to be able to offer them a job at the end of it. And investing, and companies will be loath to invest if they see that as a potential waste of money, which it can be if you're having to let people go towards the end of their period. I think the best example, or one of the best current examples of really driving investment in apprenticeships is actually in HS2. And they have been able to recruit and retain very, very significant numbers of apprentices. So what that does demonstrate, and I think the Crossrail project also did the same, is that for real investment in bringing new talent into the industry, a longer term view has to be taken. There is another issue in that we're at a time when we're in a trough that actually we're losing huge swathes of staff, and I think Rob's numbers alluded to that earlier on. And you don't lose people that are earlier in their career, you lose the people that are getting towards the end of their career, because quite frankly most of them can afford to walk away and take a little bit of risk on the next income. And what that means is that you're losing huge amounts of experience and knowledge, and that then isn't there to pass on to the next generation and the next generation there. So it's not just about apprenticeships, it's about retention of knowledge and capability within the industry.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear, maybe again from yourself, but perhaps other members of the panel as well, about what else industry needs from government in order to develop and maintain a highly skilled workforce. I don't know if any of you got views on that.
Just to follow up on Noel's point first about, we're also an ageing workforce as well in the sector, and that's something that's been long recognised. And so again, this lack of clarity and certainty. So the National Skills Academy have said that there's 200,000 people require upskilling in the coming years. Add to that as well changes in technology. There are people who are still going to be in their careers in the rail sector who need that level of kind of training, and this isn't happening at the moment. Go back to what I said before about the innovation side of things and the technology side of things. We're not keeping up with the time.
What else could government do outside of the investment pipeline stuff?
So it is providing that certain, and also that encouragement with regards to innovation, the requirement and the need for innovation, and the moving away from prescriptive specifications. So making sure that coming from the government, it's not you will deliver something that will do X, Y, and Z. It is something that will say deliver X, Y, and Z, rather than saying in order to do so you need to use these screws from this person or
understanding.
No.
Sorry, I've got a point to add on to that. I was extraordinarily disappointed that we didn't see the rail sector have its own industrial strategy. So what an industrial strategy gives you, in my view, is the ability to make investment decisions that will actually develop your supply chain, develop the technologies, develop the innovation that allow us to go back to where, and skills that allow us to go back to what we previously were, which was the inventor of the railways for across the globe. The rail industry is seen as a means of getting people to and from their very important jobs. It isn't seen as a creator of economic value in itself. And that's the thing that I would like to see most, which I think would make the biggest difference to us, that we are considered as a sector that's worth investing in because actually we're delivering more than just trains and train services.
Absolutely. The role that we have on economic growth is absolutely critical and absolutely underpins whatever else an industrial strategy might have in it. And we would absolutely agree that rail merits its own industrial strategy. I think at a very practical level, and picking up on the point that Michelle was making, 200,000 people needing upskilling training, that means a significant amount of cost. I have no idea how much, but there has to be a cost there. And there's also a time element there. So I think it's a very practical level, perhaps an understanding from government that that is a major challenge that the industry is going to be facing over the next 5+ years. Maybe it merits its own specific funding to be set aside specifically for development of the workforce, because we're talking some major activity in that area. And alongside that, and I know there's a lot of work been going on this already, is helping to make things like the apprenticeships more responsive to employers' needs. We do have employers saying apprenticeships don't meet our needs, they're too prescriptive in this area, they're too prescriptive in that area. So I think just making sure that, working with other departments, we're really being able to offer employers the best opportunities to be able to train young people that come into the sector.
Excellent. Okay, I think we need to move on now. Thank you. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. The 2015 Bow Review of CP5 said that there was, and I quote, an unhelpful lack of clear and common understanding of the scope of projects and programmes across government and industry. 10 years on, does that characterisation ring true? And if it does, can you please give the committee a couple of practical examples of how that manifests?
So yes, it absolutely does ring true, although things are slightly better than perhaps they were at that stage. I think one of the biggest challenges as we move from every control period to the next, and we've seen this, unfortunately I've seen it too many times in my career, there's often a promise that we're going to be better. The point was made earlier on, you need to be planning for projects in advance of looking to put spades in the ground. So you need to be doing that work 2 to 3 years in advance. CP5 and the Great Western Electrification Challenge, which wiped out huge swathes of expenditure and meant that there was nothing left to prepare for future projects, meant that we entered CP6 with no shovel-ready projects at all. Now, I wouldn't say that it has been the same as CP7. CP7 have had its own challenges. There is a recognition that these schemes need to be worked on at the very early stage and planned for at the very early stage, so that you don't end up starting at CP, a control period, with huge amounts of money to spend and an inability to spend it because nothing is ready to go at that point in time. So it's better, but it's still a long, long way to go.
Are you saying that projects are still entering the pipeline at a not sufficiently mature stage of planning and understanding?
Yeah, I think there is evidence across the piece, regardless of whether they are small projects or mega projects such as HS2, that projects will be much more effectively delivered if there is the right level of planning and preparation that's gone in before there is a rush to demonstrate that we're getting on with it. The Great Western Electrification is again, it's an unfortunate example, but it is a great case in point. We moved to construction of an electrification system before we even knew whether or not the ground conditions were sufficient to be able to hold up the masts that were required for it. So that is a great example of a project that was underplanned and therefore failed in delivery.
If I can perhaps pick up on a different angle to what Noel said. I think it very much builds on what Noel was saying. If I go back to 2015, and it is 10 years ago, so things have moved on, I hope. I wasn't in this job. I was at the National Skills Academy for what at the time was Railway Engineering. It's now National Skills Academy for Rail. And I was responsible for doing all the workforce planning, all the skills forecasting modelling at the time. And so from a very personal experience perspective, I can remember having some quite challenging and robust conversations with colleagues in Network Rail about some of the challenges that they either thought or didn't think they were facing or going to face with skills in particular. And I can remember two very different conversations, one in electrification where the view was everything's fine, don't know why you're doing this piece of work, to in signalling where there was a real recognition that actually that graph that Rob's quite eloquently shown with some sawtooths was a challenge, and how we were going to manage all that. So there were some very different views across Network Rail at the time, and I think probably Sir Andrew said they're a little bit, I don't know if they use the word naive in contracting, but were inexperienced in some areas of the contracting. So I think that absolutely manifested itself in some of the behaviours and some of the where people were starting from in Network Rail at that point in time. But if we move forward 10 years, the other thing that Network Rail were going through at the time was a major restructuring, and that absolutely, I'm sure, took eyes off the ball, as it were. But if we move forward 10 years, the restructuring is, now we've got the devolved routes, that's not without its challenges, and the devolved regions, but that restructuring has progressed significantly. And if we pick up on electrification, the most recent example of a completed piece of electrification on the Midland Main Line, so just to the south of Leicester, that piece of work has recently been completed on time and under budget. So I think that demonstrates what the industry can do when Network Rail and the supply chain work collaboratively, properly together. So I think we have moved on.
Okay, thank you. Scott, quite a lot of your questions been sort of answered, but I'll let you give them another chance.
So, Rob, I think in the evidence Ria gave, it said there had been that short notice changes to the work bank had significant impacts. Are you able to give examples of them and explain why the changes were made?
So I think here this is referring to perhaps what's been going on with the current control period 7. So we've seen a slightly different set of issues here. So historically, there's the sort of planning hiatus, and I know you already. What's happened as we've gone from control period 6 into 7 is at the end of control period 6, you had inflation, which came as a bit double-digit inflation, eating through a significant amount of budgets. So there was work that was not completed at the end of control period 6. That then had to be completed out of CP7 budgets once the new control period started last year. So that meant that the work that people had been expecting would go ahead last year didn't go ahead. On top of that, there was already planned quite significant swings in what type of work was going to happen in the next control period. So there's an 11% reduction in the amount of track renewals that was planned. I think certainly renewals in England and Wales regions. And a lot of that was due to be offset by a national level signalling project. Now that spending hasn't happened yet. And I think one of the key lessons about this is that whilst there's understandable reasons for those changes in funding, and inflation is absolutely outside of Network Rail's control, I think the one thing, so Andrew acknowledged this, was that it's the clear communication to the supply chain about what's happening next. That's the piece that hasn't happened. And I think that's across several of the projects. Lots of our members have been surprised by what they have seen actually coming. The other point I think is interesting is when you're developing these complex pipelines, early on you go out for procurement on, say, framework contracts. You have to make a judgment about what value you're going to put on that contract. You don't go in as low as possible. You want to give yourself flexibility on those contracts. So the headline sort of value on these does not necessarily represent the value of work that's going to come to market. So you've got another communication challenge, that you need good clients to be able to say, okay, this is specifically what we think work is coming to you and when it's coming. I would say that Network Rail's done quite a lot of work this year to improve the quality of its pipeline. It's been going through quality assuring that, but we're not quite there yet. And I think it's a fairly universal experience for companies who are working with Network Rail that they've seen changes around the volumes expected.
Right, so it's not so much, so you kind of respect the decisions that are made, a lot of it's really about how they're communicated. And just touching on some of the pipeline of work there and the specifications. So Sir Andrew was talking about how they're no longer gold-plated projects. They try to bring projects down to the kind of utilitarian needs of travellers and freight operators. So is that something you guys have been able to interface with, or is it something that's caused you a bit of stress?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily causing... it's about getting companies in early enough to help design projects. That's the key there. Where that's happened, you see some quite successful examples, but where it hasn't, you'll run into trouble quite a bit later.
I'd just add to that, we fully support the, I don't think they're quite utilitarian, but the much more fit-for-purpose solutions that are being developed, because our suppliers, our members, the industry supply chain, can see how money can be saved in each of these projects, but sometimes when the die is cast, it's set in how it has to be delivered. So it is challenging to change things through the piece, but if you can get in early enough to actually help people understand how this can be done more effectively, then we've got a much better chance of being successful.
A bit of engagement is needed there, and where else perhaps good to just touch on engagement is around the need for a strategic plan. So I think everybody agrees we want one, and our strategy is fantastic. So is there anything else you want to see in that? And do you feel your voices are being heard in terms of its development?
I would just say I think there's a real mindset shift here, that it's so much more efficient for the public sector if we can get onto a steady long-term run rate of investment across all the different asset types. The strategic plunge that we need to take is sort of making that as a long-term commitment, not necessarily budgetary commitment, but a long-term strategic commitment. So you need to start with, what are your expectations around future freight growth, future passenger growth? And
are those things compatible? Because we want masses more passengers, masses more freight. Can we do both?
Hopefully, and I think the question is, what's the price tag, of course, but you've got a 75% freight growth target. We have got projections of passenger growth growing 37 to 97% by 2050, depending on government policies, big range. There's a lot to plan for there. We think that if you know what you want from the railway over that timescale, it's not actually that difficult to do the long-term maths. And rail's all about doing that long-term maths of, what rate are your assets degenerating and what capability do you need to provide. So if we do the long-term maths, actually, you can work out annually how many trains do you need, what numbers of kilometres of electrification do you need, how much digital signalling are we going to need. And that's the shift that we need to get to. We need to work out what the annual value is and get that programmed in.
Anything else on that?
So if you've got that long-term strategy, then you can plan, as Rob was saying. What it feels like at the moment is that we're very good at writing reports in the industry and coming up with lots of nice, pretty slides and presentations. We're not that great at the action, and sometimes that's because the big report says, actually, to do all of this, we need to spend a significant sum of money. So what the strategy should do is enable us to then say, actually, the bits of that report that we do need to action is a smaller amount of money, and that will take us on the right journey. What we tend to do at the moment is, because that's sort of difficult, we don't do anything. And it stifles that decision making. So we do lots and lots of analysis, and then we get the paralysis by analysis syndrome. So that long-term strategy should really help what Rob is.
I've got a point to add to that. I think what the industry would really benefit from is the government setting a long-term vision strategy plan for the industry, and then stepping back and allowing a body such as Great British Railways to get on and deliver that most effectively within the budget constraints that we've got. I think that is probably what's going to make the biggest difference.
Yeah, I like that kind of strategy, and then let the technocrats get on with it, rather than the kind of what I call political meddling earlier. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. With the move to a brand new world of GBR, how do you feel that GBR could be best structured to deliver a more robust investment pipeline?
Well, going back to my earlier point is probably the first point. Set it up and allow it to get on with it within the constraints of the political strategy. I think the integration of track and train is absolutely critical. I think we talked earlier about our ability to get things wrong when the two are looked independently. They are different things. A long-term rolling stock strategy is a different thing to a long-term infrastructure strategy, but they have to be compatible. They have to be thought through. You can't build an entire fleet of new trains for the southern region without upgrading the power supply system so that it can actually operate. So the integration of track and train, again, is critical, is absolutely critical for success. But then I think that the point is, where do we want to get to? Where as a nation do we want our rail industry to provide services? How do we want those services to provide? And actually sometimes it makes sense to reduce services because there is going to be a greater good elsewhere. Might be in terms of maintenance, it might be in terms of freight operation. Is it better to be running a one-car unit with 2 people on it at 1 o'clock in the morning from A to B when a bus would do the job, if you're stopping a freight train operating along that same route? So taking the whole system view in terms of costs and benefits is absolutely critical for us to be able to do what we're doing effectively.
I think obviously I'm going to agree with, I'm just going to carry on the theme of the day, but I think when you talk about the structure, I think there is that risk that we follow that regional view that we've got with Network Rail at the moment, that you might have you remove that lack of cohesive working together, you end up having different ways of working. We've just seen with the CP7 contracting process that each of the regions went through a different tendering process. So the supply chain were having to do different means of tendering, different hoops to jump through for each of the regions, which were all happening at the same time as these people are trying to do their day job. I think we need to be really careful about that, especially because we all want that integration of the track and train. So I think there's got to be clear levels of accountability. I think there's got to be clear levels of autonomy so that GBR can get on and do what it is that they need to do. But I think one of the pieces that hasn't been touched on yet is that the cultural side of it, to make sure that culturally it's an enabler for growth and it's an enabler for development, rather than it being something that could stagnate and prevent that from happening.
If I could just pick up on a couple of those cultural points, I think that's spot on. The numbers of people involved in the organisation obviously mean it's going to take time to build that culture and for it to be set from the leadership. Some of the things that may shape culture, the financial framework around Great British Railways, which will be set by Treasury, could have a huge influence on attitudes within the business to taking decisions. So, is it going to incentivise long-term good value for money decisions, or will there be a focus on short-term cost management? Or will GBR be able to grow revenues over the longer run? That's a key question. I think that will flow through the business as budgets often dictate culture. More in terms of being a transparent, innovation-friendly organisation that's easy to work with, the GBR will be under a licence, and that licence needs to not just say what outcomes GBR should deliver, but also how it should behave. I think that's a really important part in terms of external accountability. There's been some examples recently around using licences in a number of sectors to set behavioural expectations. And just to reinforce the point on bidding costs, so we've seen examples where large projects such as Midland Main Line, companies can easily spend over $1 million just bidding for these. If you fragment that right across the network, then you are going to multiply those costs.
Okay, thank you.
There's a role therefore for a really strong piece of leadership from system operator, whatever the future system operator looks like, to make sure that we have that cohesion, but we retain that more regional accountability.
Okay.
So I take your point that obviously it doesn't make sense for different regions of Network Rail to be following different processes, and hopefully within whatever format of a regionalised structure, if there is one in GBR, that might be wiped out. But what we do know is that there's going to be more devolved mayors, strategic authorities and the like. Do you think that therefore there's a case for making some investment decisions in a more decentralised way?
I think there's two sides to that. I think if we're talking about kind of closed loop systems that are entirely within that authority, then absolutely that's the combined authority's money for it to spend in the best way that it is for its region. I think if we're talking about the national network, I think consultation is absolutely imperative, but without that level of control, because that could then fall into wherever we are with the political cycles, political appointments, rather than actually looking at it from a national network point of view.
I would add to that. I think it's very, very clear, and there are many, many examples where local decisions deliver better local outcomes. We've seen that within TfL, with it devolved. We've seen it within Transport for Wales. We've seen it within Liverpool, within many, many local areas. However, they cannot be made in isolation. The example of a train going from York to Liverpool will go through at least 4 devolved authorities, and they cannot operate without understanding the impact they're having elsewhere. So there has to be a national strategy, but there should be the ability to make local decisions on where funding is going to make the biggest impact.
Okay, can I, we've got one final section, but I just wanted to pick up on an issue that comes at, it's part of the national narrative, which is cost control. Government, of course, is under pressure to show that contracted costs can be controlled, and HS2 being the most glaring example. Do you have a view about how industry and government can best work together to address this challenge?
Yeah, there is absolutely a need for contracting costs to be minimised. And HS2 will unfortunately provide us many, many examples of what could be done differently. But there are many, many factors that have contributed to the cost of HS2, and that
we'll park the change in policy, but some of the other areas.
There are lots of good examples of how the right contracting environment can create value. We see, and our members have seen, those that are part of it, the Southern renewals that Sir Andrew talked about a little earlier, being a really good example of how to use the supply base, working with Network Rail, working with those that are setting the policy to drive good, efficient and economic delivery of projects. What we need to do, rather than focus on just what has gone wrong, is highlight what's going right and make sure we repeat that, because it's often easier to do that than just solve the problems of not making the same mistake again.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this committee and Public Accounts Committee are on HS2's back, as you know, so but thank you. Okay, Steph.
Thank you, and thanks for the various elucidating comments about the characteristics or features of this investment pipeline that we've been talking about, the timescales, what's in and out of scope at what stage, etc. I want to come back to something you said, Noel, about the rolling stock question, and obviously track and train at a GBR level, but should that extend to including rolling stock within the pipeline, or does it need a separate pipeline?
So I think I sort of alluded to the point earlier on. There needs to be a separate pipeline, but the two have to be connected.
Yeah.
They absolutely have to be connected, and rolling stock orders are set almost entirely by government policy. The huge uplift in new train orders that we saw over the past 10 years, which have tailed off to zero at this point in time, were driven by a very simple change to the scoring mechanism within how franchises were let, where a much higher level of quality rating was attributed to new rolling stock, and therefore people could win a franchise purely on the basis of the quality score that they had got. Now, rolling stock, we do have a tendency to focus on rolling stock from a new build perspective, but the lack of a rolling stock strategy just doesn't affect the 4 factories, which are being very significantly affected now. It massively affects the market for maintenance and overhaul and renewal and upgrade of rolling stock. And we've seen huge impact on many of our members and many of the Rail Forum's members on a lack of a long-term plan around improvement, overhaul and upgrade. And many upgrade projects can produce rolling stock to the travelling customer, which is every bit as good as brand new. So this needs to be looked at holistically, and the long-term plan will allow us to put in place the right level of capability within that upgrade overhaul market as well as within the new build market, and it is absolutely critical that we reach that.
If I can add to that, because I would absolutely agree that aftermarket, as we tend to refer to it, has really struggled in recent years too. Having that long-term view helps not just the new, it helps the aftermarket too. GBR is a real opportunity. because there is an opportunity to move away from what has traditionally been relatively shorter term franchising and relatively shorter term leases. So if you own an asset that has a 35-year life and you've got a lease agreement for, say, 8 years, do you want to invest in it to keep it in just in case it's going to be released? If there are longer leases, then that would enable a much better planning and investment profile from the private sector to really support that longer term plan.
And if I can just add on one of the reasons for the interconnectivity as well in having some level of overlap is that if you've got track being looked at over here and questions raised as to whether we're going to electrify a route, but on the other hand you've got a new rolling stock order has just been placed for diesel trains for that route. I mean they've got to talk to each other, which they don't necessarily at the moment.
And Elaine, you've elucidated particularly, you've spoken about the role of private finance in rolling stock. It's been a bit of a delicious lightning rod for private investment. I wonder if anyone on the panel has any specific thoughts about where private finance could add value, particularly to enhancements, for instance. Is there a greater role for it, different role for it in the future that we're entering into?
I would say that it's definitely something we need to be looking at hard as the railway, and there's a couple of different rationales for it. So firstly, there's private funding and there's private finance, which is somewhat different. So we should be doing everything we can to attract third-party funding to the railway. That could be contributions from devolved authorities, but it might also be from developers, and the relationship between housing and rail is one that's going to be really important. So station development areas obviously have the ability, we've heard there's new powers to sort of do land assembly around stations. If you could use that to leverage contributions, what we look for is that then some of that funding is put into upgrading those stations. Yeah. And there's obviously other funding sources as well. You can do local small-scale energy generation, car parking, retail, all of that stuff you see that sort of actually grows community economies. On the private finance side, I think clearly the rolling stock model has successfully allowed finance to come in and fund lots of rolling stock. I think there's an interesting question about whether you could extend that model or other models to infrastructure. I think Jeremy Westlake recognised there's, if you like, a gap at the moment around infrastructure financing particularly. I think it's a really key sort of policy moment for government. I think one of the things we always say is what you need is a central government policy decision about what private investment models will be allowed for rail. Because at the moment there's lots of ideas that have been developed for different schemes. But you tend not to find out until the 12th hour whether or not you're able to go ahead, because it goes up to the Treasury and then will go off to the ONS for a decision on is it on balance sheet or off balance sheet. Actually, what we need to do is collaborate with the government about what's the sort of models that the government thinks will bring best value for money, and then where might the private sector come in. But there is value there in that you're talking about, first of all, risk transfer to the private sector. So if you're talking about sort of risks of overruns, you can certainly transfer long-term risk to the private sector. Secondly, in terms of the actual, just the length of the concessions and the ability to smooth investment across that. That's an easy model to get your sort of investment from the supply chain in skills and innovation. So that's the rationale we should be thinking about it. It doesn't make it easy, but it's worth us investing some time in, I think.
I think there is one example which I think is unfortunately forgotten, but my 30-odd years of experience allow me not to. There's a project called Project Evergreen, which was one of the first franchises that were let by the government under the privatisation, and that was to Chiltern Railways. Yeah. And it was the only franchise that was let under a 22-year period. And that allowed very significant investment and upgrades to the line. I used to work on Thames and Chiltern when I first started on the railway many years ago. And the difference that was made by allowing the private sector to come in and invest to improve the overall infrastructure stations and rolling stock because they had that long-term contract was absolutely remarkable. And it's something that we should probably look back to see whether there's anything to learn from.
Not quite Belt and Road, but clearly a role. Any other comments? No. Thank you. Great.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about wider industrial strategies, similar to a question that posed for the previous panel. Of course, the situation at British Steel's Scunthorpe Long Products division, I think, is at the forefront of all our minds. So I wanted to ask, in general, what opportunities you think there are for the rail industry to support the UK's wider industrial base, but if anyone had any comments about the potential implications for the wider rail supply chain if Scunthorpe were to cease operations, then that would be appreciated also.
I'll start off. I'm sure my colleagues can add some stuff to it. Then first of all, the industry absolutely supports the need for support for British Steel, and they are a very, very significant supplier of many different products. They're a supplier to one of my companies. I manufacture wagons in Mansfield, and a lot of our steel comes from British Steel, but probably more critically, they manufacture most of the rail that's used to replace. So having access to a local supplier is absolutely critical. One of the things that I've learnt most over years, I have an experience of going back to probably 8 years ago, where I was at, there's an international exhibition called Inatrans, and we hosted a reception at the British ambassador's house for the industry, and we had the Director of Procurement for Deutsche Bahn as the keynote speaker, and it was attended by the great and good of the railway supply chain, and it'll always stick with me because he came in and laughed at us. He laughed at us because he said, "You Brits, you're crazy." Okay, I'll not use a German accent. He said, "You Brits, you're crazy." He said, "I've got 2 jobs as the Director of Procurement for Deutsche Bahn. The first one is to supply good value for money, high quality products for the use of Deutsche Bahn in providing its services to the public. But the second job, and it's every bit as important as the first job, is creating a strong long-term supply chain that can go and take German products to the international market." Now, Deutsche Bahn was able to do that within the constraints of the EU procurement rules. We've always applied them slightly differently, and I think the change to supporting local manufacturing and local services to strengthen them, to allow them to go then and compete on an international stage, cannot be underestimated. And that's why I believe we should have had an industrial strategy for the rail sector as well.
Thank you.
And I would 100% support that because, particularly from a manufacturing perspective, we have got 4 factories, as Noel's already said, from a rolling stock manufacturing perspective in the UK. We do need to export. That isn't just about those factories, it's about all the supply chain that supports those factories. But not just in rail manufacturing, there are lots of other opportunities, be it design, be it digital, where we can lead the world and where we should be leading the world, and the rail industry has a really important role to play in supporting that and helping to drive that, again, from an export perspective. And I think the final point I would make is that, beyond that, we have a really important role in helping to drive economic growth, social inclusion, lots of important issues that the country faces. And all of that means that we are absolutely critical to whatever industrial strategy finally gets published for whatever sectors. We absolutely have a critical role to play in all of that.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to the end of our evidence today, and thank you to you all for your contributions. Everything we've heard has been really, really informative. It's laid the groundwork for the weeks ahead and the subsequent sessions. We look forward to taking any further evidence as we progress with our inquiry, and also, as I said before, anything you want to submit in writing in addition that you felt wasn't drawn out sufficiently today or you haven't already submitted. That concludes today's meeting.